In a small Minnesota town surrounded by fields that stretched as far as the eye could see, lived a man named Richard Wallace. He was known among his neighbors for his practical mind and for never being impressed by spiritual stories or ancient beliefs. Whenever someone spoke of reincarnation, near-death experiences, or anything that escaped what he considered tangible reality, Richard reacted with a wry smile and a short laugh, as if it were nothing but fantasy for weak minds. For him, life was simple. One was born, worked hard, and in the end, all that remained was the eternal silence of a body buried in the cold earth. Nothing more. Richard's marriage to Claire, however, presented a curious contrast. While he scoffed at anything spiritual, she maintained a certain openness, a silent respect for what couldn't be explained. She wasn't devoutly religious, but she believed there were mysteries beyond human grasp. This difference was never a cause for serious arguments, but it created small tensions, especially when it came to raising their daughter, little Emily, who hadn't yet turned 5. Richard insisted on teaching her to view the world concretely, while Claire encouraged her to dream and respect the signs that life brought. That year's winter arrived early, covering the town with thick layers of snow. Inside their warm home, Emily played with dolls and spent hours talking to herself like many children her age. Richard didn't mind, thinking it normal for her to have her own imaginary world. However, on one particularly silent night, with only the wind rattling the windows, he noticed something strange. Emily wasn't talking to her dolls in English, as she always did, but in a language that sounded completely unfamiliar to him. The words came out quickly, as if natural, laden with a rhythmic cadence unlike anything he had ever heard. At first, Richard believed it was just child's play. Perhaps his daughter was imitating sounds she'd heard on a cartoon or television. But as he got closer, he realized it was more than just a game. Emily seemed focused, her gaze fixed, almost as if another presence was speaking through her. The tone was not one of fantasy, but of conviction, and this made the man uncomfortable. Still, Richard laughed, shaking his head and telling himself it was just a child's game. The next morning at breakfast, Claire commented that she had also noticed their daughter's behavior. Emily continued to use those strange words, sometimes even singing snippets that sounded like ancient songs. Claire, intrigued, asked her husband if he thought it was normal. Richard responded sarcastically, stating that the girl simply had too vivid an imagination. But behind his laughter, there was a growing unease. Something within him began to waver, though he wouldn't admit it. Days passed and the strangeness intensified. Emily no longer spoke only when she was alone. On some occasions, she used that language in front of her parents, as if trying to communicate something important. Richard tried to scold her, telling her she should speak English, but the girl just looked at him with disconcerting calm, as if she didn't understand the demand. Sometimes, it even seemed like she didn't recognize him as her father, as if her eyes were gazing far beyond him. One evening, while reading the newspaper in the living room, Richard heard his daughter reciting long sentences in that mysterious language. This time, however, the words were accompanied by hand gestures, gentle movements that resembled rituals. He felt a shiver run down his spine. There was no television on, no book open before her, just that fixed gaze into the void, and a voice that didn't sound childlike. It was at this moment that something changed within him. For the first time, his easy laughter gave way to a heavy silence, as if he were facing something he couldn't simply ignore. The next morning, Richard decided to take Emily to the pediatrician, believing that perhaps some psychological problem was behind it. The doctor, however, found nothing abnormal. The girl was healthy, with above-average development, and no signs of disorders. When asked about the speaking in another language, Richard downplayed it, but Claire, more honest, reported details. The pediatrician merely suggested observation, emphasizing that many children create their own languages. Yet, deep down, Richard knew it wasn't that. The words that came from Emily's mouth had a weight, structure, and musicality that no child's invention would possess. That same week, during an unexpected visit from an older neighbor, an unforeseen event brought even more disturbance. The woman, named Margaret, had lived much of her life traveling as a history and ancient languages teacher. When she heard Emily murmur a few sentences, she paled, dropping her teacup from her hands. With a trembling voice, She asked where the child had learned that. Richard replied sharply, saying it was just a game. But Margaret, still in shock, stated that the girl was speaking Sanskrit, a dead language almost no one mastered, except dedicated scholars. The silence that followed this revelation was almost suffocating. Claire was speechless, while Richard, though he tried to maintain his skeptical stance, felt the ground of his convictions tremble. How could a 4-year-old child, without access to any academic material, reproduce sounds from a language he himself had never heard before? The easy laughter no longer came. In its place was an uneasiness that accompanied him even at night, when he tried to sleep and was haunted by the memories of his daughter's voice echoing in the dark. Emily, however, seemed increasingly serene. She showed no fear or strangeness about what she was doing. On the contrary, there was an almost supernatural tranquility in her, as if she were simply remembering something that had always belonged to her. Sometimes she looked at her parents with tenderness, and in her small eyes there was a wisdom that did not match her age. Richard, no matter how much he tried to resist, felt observed, almost judged by that calm he didn't understand. In the solitude of his reflections, he began to recall all the times he had laughed at others' beliefs. He remembered conversations at work, where he mocked colleagues who spoke of soul or spirituality. He recalled the arrogance with which he said that after death there was nothing. Now, sitting by his daughter's bed, listening to her murmur in Sanskrit as if reciting ancient prayers, Richard was no longer so sure. That week, the atmosphere inside the Wallace home transformed. What was once just routine, made up of hurried breakfasts, work, and small evening conversations, became filled with a strange, silent tension. Emily continued to speak in that mysterious language, sometimes with short phrases, sometimes with long speeches that sounded like ancient prayers. What was frightening was not just the sound of the words, but the serenity with which they were spoken, as if they carried a greater force that could not be understood. Richard, increasingly restless, tried to convince himself that everything had a rational explanation. He spent hours on the computer, researching children who created their own languages, or cases where children's imaginations simulated non-existent knowledge. However, the more he read, the more confused he became. There was nothing to justify the richness of his daughter's language, nor the fact that she seemed to understand every syllable she pronounced, as if she were transmitting messages from a distant place. One night after Emily fell asleep, Claire suggested that perhaps they should seek someone who could better understand what was happening. "A scholar, an ancient languages professor," she said, her voice low, almost fearing her husband's reaction. Richard reacted with impatience, but didn't immediately refuse. Deep down, he knew he needed answers. So, a few days later, they invited Margaret again, asking her to bring a retired professor from the local university, a specialist in the history of religions. The professor, a white-haired man with a keen gaze named Daniel Whitmore, listened attentively as Emily, sitting on the living room floor, murmured phrases in Sanskrit. He not only recognized the language, but also translated some passages. According to him, they were ancient verses connected to Vedic hymns, used thousands of years ago in spiritual rituals in India. The girl's precise pronunciation impressed him. "It's impossible for her to have learned this on her own," he said seriously. "Not even advanced students can recite like this without years of study." Richard felt a lump in his throat. His mind frantically searched for an explanation. Perhaps Emily had heard something on television or in some lost internet video. But Daniel assured him that those passages were not found in common media and that the cadence resembled ancient, almost extinct oral practices. Claire, for her part, simply watched her daughter with teary eyes, as if intuiting that something greater was happening. As the weeks passed, Emily began to reveal more than just words. At certain moments, she described places she had never seen, speaking of wide rivers, tall temples, markets full of people in colorful clothes, and the sound of bells in the background. She made gestures as if she were sewing fine fabrics or carrying clay pots. When questioned, she spoke with the naturalness of someone describing childhood memories. For Richard, hearing that was like watching cracks open in the walls of his unshakable certainty. One particular episode deeply affected him. During a family dinner, Emily put her cutlery aside and, looking into the void, began to hum a soft, almost hypnotic melody in Sanskrit. Professor Daniel, who occasionally visited the family to keep up with developments, closed his eyes and listened intently. At the end, he explained that it seemed to be a mantra linked to the cycle of life, death, and rebirth. Claire put her hand to her chest, moved, but Richard felt a chill that left him breathless. It was as if his daughter was speaking directly to something that transcended his comprehension. His nights of sleep became a challenge. When he closed his eyes, he remembered his daughter's voice echoing in the dark, and the silence of the house became an unbearable weight. He began to have vivid dreams, images of temples lit by torches, people dressed in white robes, serene rivers where bodies were placed on rafts to float downstream. He woke up sweating, his heart racing, not understanding where these visions came from. Were they just the fruit of his disturbed mind or echoes of what Emily unintentionally conveyed? One cold late afternoon, Richard decided to talk directly to his daughter. He sat beside her as she played with wooden blocks and asked, "Emily, where did you learn those words?" The girl stopped, looked into her father's eyes with disconcerting calm, and replied in English in a soft voice, "I didn't learn them, Daddy. I remember." Richard froze. There was no possible laughter in the face of the seriousness of that sentence. The child went back to playing as if nothing had happened, but the weight of her words echoed within him like thunder. In the following days, he began to observe Emily even more closely. He noticed how, at times, she seemed to disconnect from the present, as if living two lives simultaneously, that of a common American child and that of someone carrying memories of a distant past. On one occasion, while walking down the snow-covered street, she suddenly stopped, pointed to the horizon and said, There was a wide river, and people came to bring flowers for the spirits. There was no river, only houses and trees dried by winter. Richard felt his heart tighten, not knowing what to answer. The psychological pressure began to reflect in his behavior. At work he could no longer concentrate. At home his patience quickly ran out. He found himself torn between two forces, the logical mind that demanded proof, and the inescapable reality of a daughter who seemed to carry the memory of another existence. Each day he felt closer to an invisible limit, as if he were about to cross a boundary he had always rejected. One Sunday night, sitting alone in the living room, Richard looked at the family photographs hanging on the wall. He felt an enormous void as he realized that perhaps he had never truly known his daughter. Who was Emily, after all? Just a child? Or the manifestation of something much older, something that defied all his convictions? The easy laughter, which had once been his refuge against any spiritual idea, now seemed distant, almost childish. For the first time, he faced the possibility of having been wrong his entire life. The following weeks plunged Richard into a whirlwind of emotions he had never imagined experiencing. Each day, Emily seemed to reveal another fragment of a life that couldn't possibly belong to a child. There were moments when she would sit by the frost-covered window and silently murmur words in Sanskrit, as if they were prayers, her gaze lost somewhere beyond the physical world. There were also nights when she spoke in her sleep, repeating long phrases, laden with cadence and emotion, as if recalling dialogues from long ago. Richard began to record everything in a notebook. He noted down every word, every gesture, every different look from his daughter, as if through this he could find some logic. But, no matter how much he wrote, he felt increasingly distant from reason. The notebook, instead of being an instrument of order, transformed into a diary of hauntings. He would flip through it before bed and had the strange sensation that he was witnessing a spiritual testimony, not just a list of events. On a quiet Saturday afternoon, Claire took Emily to play in the snow-covered backyard. Richard, sitting on the porch, watched from a distance when his daughter suddenly began drawing strange symbols in the snow with a branch. They weren't ordinary child's scribbles. They were geometric shapes, circles within squares, crossed lines that resembled ancient inscriptions. Claire, intrigued, asked what it meant, and Emily replied without hesitation, "It's to remember the temple house, Mommy, so I don't forget." The impact of these words was devastating for Richard. The naturalness of the answer, the gentle conviction in his daughter's voice, her distant gaze. Everything pointed to something impossible to ignore. He felt his throat go dry, as if the air around him had become dense. For the first time in a long time, there was no room for sarcasm or disbelief, only silence and a reverent fear that would accompany him for days to come. That night, unable to sleep, Richard went downstairs and found Emily awake in the living room, quietly playing with her dolls. But something was different. She wasn't just moving the dolls, she seemed to be orchestrating a ritualistic scene, placing them in a circle, as if recreating a ceremony. She murmured in Sanskrit, but upon noticing her father's presence, she looked up and spoke in English, with a surprisingly grave tone for her age. "The memories come because you need to believe." Richard froze in place. Those words didn't sound like a child's game. They were a message, direct, profound, laden with intent. He tried to ask what it meant, but Emily just went back to playing, as if nothing had happened. The man stood still for long minutes, watching her, feeling his heart pounding, as if he had witnessed something that completely surpassed him. The following days were marked by growing unease. Richard avoided talking about what was happening with colleagues or neighbors, fearing judgment. Only Claire knew how shaken he was, though she too tried to maintain an apparent calm to protect her husband and daughter. But deep down, even she recognized that something spiritual was manifesting unequivocally. However, an event pushed Richard to a point of no return. One early morning, he was awakened by his daughter's voice coming from the next room. Emily was speaking loudly in Sanskrit, but this time the words were accompanied by an intense melody, almost like a ceremonial chant. Richard rushed into the room and found the girl sitting on the bed, eyes closed, arms raised, as if guided by an invisible force. He ran to her, but before he could touch her, Emily opened her eyes and, in English, said clearly, "I've died before, Daddy. I remember the water, the fire, and my last breath." The impact was so strong that Richard fell to his knees beside the bed, unable to react. He felt a deep chill invade his body, mixed with a strange sense of reverence. Emily then lay back down and fell asleep, as if nothing had happened. Richard remained there for long minutes, his face buried in his hands until he finally got up, feeling that something inside him had broken forever. The next day, for the first time in many years, Richard neither mocked nor denied. He sought out Margaret and Professor Daniel, begging for help, for explanations, for any clue that could make sense of what he was experiencing. Daniel, with his usual calm, said that Emily's experience resembled accounts of children who seemed to carry memories of past lives. It wasn't common, but there were documented records in various parts of the world. Margaret moved, added that perhaps Emily had come to teach something not only to her parents, but also to everyone around them. Richard listened in silence, but felt an intense battle within him. His logical mind screamed that it was all impossible, but his heart could no longer deny it. He spent hours looking at his daughter, who ran around the yard like any child, and wondered who was before him, little Emily, or an ancient soul, reborn to reveal something greater. The following weeks became an exercise in surrender. Richard began to avoid jokes about reincarnation, set aside the sarcasm he always carried, and started to listen carefully to every word his daughter spoke. Once Emily held his hand and said, "You need to stop laughing at what you don't understand, Daddy. I'm here to show you that life doesn't end." This simple sentence was like a key turning inside him. For the first time, Richard cried in front of his daughter, allowing the armor of disbelief to fall for a few moments. In the silence of the night, he reflected on everything. If life didn't end with death, as he had always believed, then what happened to us afterward? Could it be possible that the soul truly traversed centuries, carrying fragments of experiences? And if it were true, what would be Emily's purpose in being there, in that family, in that small house in Minnesota? Richard had no answers, but he no longer rejected them. He was ready to listen, ready to learn, even if it meant dismantling the entire structure of beliefs he had carried throughout his life. His daughter, so small, had become his greatest teacher, and though it was difficult to admit, he began to accept that perhaps, just perhaps, the laughter he had always used to ward off the unknown was, in fact, a shield against a truth that had been awaiting him all along. Richard's transformation didn't happen overnight, but it was inevitable. The man who once scoffed at any mention of life after death now spent hours reflecting on what he had previously dismissed without even considering. His notebook, once filled with cold notes, also began to fill with personal reflections, almost like a diary of confessions. He wrote about his fears, about the fragility of his certainties, and about the astonishment of seeing his daughter carry memories that could in no way be the product of childish imagination. One morning, Richard was watching Emily play in the yard when she suddenly stopped and looked up at the sky. Snow fell slowly, and the sunlight reflected in crystals that seemed to dance in the air. Emily raised her arms and said in English with a calm voice, "Life is like snow, Daddy. It falls, melts, disappears, but it always comes back." Richard felt a shiver run through his body. That simple sentence carried a wisdom he had never imagined hearing from such a small child. From that day on, he began to accompany Emily differently. He no longer tried to correct her when she spoke in Sanskrit, nor did he ask her to stop her improvised rituals. On the contrary, he watched with attention, as if each gesture were a key to understanding something that had always eluded him. Claire noticed the change in her husband, and in her eyes was a mix of relief and emotion. She knew that this journey was not just for their daughter, but for the entire family. A remarkable episode occurred during a visit to the local lake, where the family used to stroll on weekends. It was a tranquil place, surrounded by pine trees and always covered in silence during winter. As they walked along the frozen shore, Emily stopped and fixed her eyes on the horizon. Then she put her hands together, as if in prayer, and began to recite in Sanskrit. The words echoed over the ice, creating an almost sacred atmosphere. Richard and Claire stood motionless, listening, feeling something that went beyond rational understanding. When Emily finished, she looked at her parents and said, "This too is a place of passage, like the river that carried me before." Richard felt his legs tremble. He didn't know how to deal with that revelation. His daughter's words resonated in him for days, as if pointing to something greater. The idea that places carry memories, that the earth and water hold ancient stories, and that life, in its essence, is a succession of arrivals and departures. As time passed, Emily seemed to mature in a strange way. She was still a child, playing, running, and laughing like any other. But at certain moments her expression changed, her gaze became profound, and the feeling was that a much older consciousness inhabited that small body. Richard wondered if she herself was fully aware of it, or if she simply lived between two worlds, that of childhood and that of an ancient soul carrying memories of past lives. One rainy night, Richard decided to talk more openly with Claire. They sat in the living room, only the faint light of the fireplace illuminating the room. He confessed his fears, told her how lost he felt, and how everything he had always believed was unraveling before his eyes. Claire listened in silence, holding his hand. When she finally spoke, she simply said, "Perhaps that's what Emily came to teach us, not to be afraid to look beyond what we know." These words were etched in Richard's mind. For the first time, he didn't feel alone in his transformation. He realized that alongside his wife, he could face the mystery without so much resistance. Emily, for her part, continued to manifest in unexpected ways. One morning, during breakfast, she began to speak in English about a woman who had loved lotus flowers, describing gardens and temples where these flowers were offered in ceremonies. The richness of detail was impressive, as if she had truly walked through those places. Richard, no longer having the strength to doubt, just listened. And the more he listened, the more he felt something opening within him, as if a veil was slowly being removed from his eyes. He no longer sought only explanations, but began to embrace the mystery as part of life. It was a subtle but profound change. One day, during a visit from Professor Daniel, Emily did something that surprised even the scholar. She took a sheet of paper and with simple strokes drew symbols that resembled ancient characters. Daniel, impressed, explained that it was similar to inscriptions used in Vedic manuscripts. "It's impossible for her to know this on her own," he said, shaking his head in disbelief. Richard felt a mixture of pride and fear. His daughter not only spoke a dead language, but seemed to carry with her knowledge that spanned centuries. That same day, as dusk fell, Emily approached her father and said something that completely disarmed him. "You don't need to be afraid, Daddy. When we die, it's not the end. I remember coming back, and I'll come back again whenever it's needed." Richard, with tear-filled eyes, couldn't answer. He just hugged her, feeling a wave of emotion that left him speechless. It was as if at that moment he finally accepted that there was something beyond, that life was not a period, but a continuous line that crossed time. The changes in Richard also began to be noticed by others. At work, colleagues found his calmer, less sarcastic demeanor strange. Friends who used to laugh with him about spiritual matters now perceived his respectful silence. He no longer made a point of mocking what he didn't understand. On the contrary, he began to listen, to ask, to reflect. It was as if Emily had planted a seed in him that grew every day. One night, alone in his room, Richard opened the notebook where he recorded everything and wrote a sentence he never imagined writing. "Perhaps I have spent my life laughing at what mattered most." When he finished, he closed his eyes and felt a strange peace, almost as if a part of him had finally stopped fighting. Emily remained a child full of energy, but her presence had become, for Richard, a constant reminder that the mystery of existence cannot be reduced to what the eyes see. With every word in Sanskrit, every ritualistic gesture, she showed that life is much vaster than any limited belief could encompass. And so in that small house in Minnesota, a man who scoffed at reincarnation found himself transformed by his own daughter, learning each day that death is not the end, but merely a door that opens to a larger path.